Hey guys, welcome back to another painting guide. Today I will show you how you can paint some proper high quality Ultramarines as the codex astartes demands. So courage and honor brothers, we will paint blue today. As you might know, Ultramarines are my favorite Space Marine chapter and legion. They are the best and no one can convince me otherwise. But for some reason there is barely any Ultramarine content on the channel, except some old speed painting videos, and we can't have that. Also, if you have been following my Patreon, you might know that I started another crazy diorama project, and since the Space Marine Captain is going to be one of the centerpieces on that one, obviously he has to be an Ultramarine. So I have all the excuses I need to paint a proper boy in blue, and since he will be the protagonist of the diorama, I will go all out this time. No speed painting for him, I will use all the tools and tricks I know to make him look as good as possible. And since we are fully codex compliant here, I will use mostly Citadel paints for the highlighting process to make it easier for most of you to follow along and show your buddies that no chapter looks better than the Ultramarines. As usual, if you want to see a lot more real-time painting footage or want the almost 100-page PDF guide right at your fingertips when you paint your own favorite Smurfs, then head over to my Patreon. You will get access to a ton of extra learning material, and it is also the best way to support the channel so I can keep doing what I do. Alright, enough with the intro, let's paint some Ultramarines. I started from a black prime model, but that won't be good enough for us. If I start from here, the shadows will be black and boring, and I won't get the nice punchy blue I need. So I take corn red and base coat the entire model with it. I use this red because red is a great shadow color for blue and one of the ways you can make your blues pop much more. I have a whole video dedicated to these little color tricks, so check that out if you want to know more. It is important that this won't be a zenithal highlight, so I'm not just spraying from above and leaving the shadows untouched. I spray this indiscriminately all over the model, including the shadows. In fact, it's more important to have this in the shadows since that's where I want to keep this color later. And now I will use another trick to get really punchy colors in the end. I take some white ink and I spray it from a zenithal angle where the light would hit the armor panels the most. I don't spray the deepest shadows at all. In the highest highlights I add multiple layers until I get mostly full coverage, and in between I only spray a little. This creates a fade effect from dark red to full white. I also spray the right shoulder pad full white at this point since it's supposed to be white anyway, so this will be a good base color to paint over later. Okay, now it's time to paint some actual blue. And to do this I will use Ultramarine ink. And I use the ink because it will give me a much better color than any normal paint would, and I use this specific one because this time I wanted to paint a proper Ultramarine, not a Prussian blue one like I usually do. And if you don't have this specific Ultramarine ink, it's not a problem at all. You can use any other brand or replace it with the Ultramarine contrast paint from Citadel. It won't be as colorful in my experience, but it will be close. And now you can probably see why we use the white underpainting. Inks are transparent and they need a light undercoat to really show what they can do. I use multiple coats to cover the white fully. I'm avoiding the red shadows mostly, but a little overspray there will just smooth out the transition more, so it's fine. And as a result, now we have a model with red shadows and ultramarine blue midtones and highlights. And the highlights are visibly brighter as well thanks to the white underpainting. This is not nearly enough contrast though, so it's time for another round of white ink underpainting. I spray this into the same highlight spots again, but this time I keep it much smaller, leaving plenty of the blue around it visible. I use this deep blue ink since it's slightly brighter and more importantly a different tone from the ultramarine. This will make the armor more interesting, but the midtones will still be the proper ultramarine color. Once again, it's not an issue if you overspray a little going into the ultramarine as well. It will just help blend things together and establish a nice transition. And now it's time to switch to normal paints. We have enough saturated blue on there so we can afford to lose some by using paints with white in them. So I dilute Altdorf Guard Blue quite a bit with around 80% thinner, and I spray it carefully inside the deep blue highlights, leaving some of the darker colors still visible. Here it becomes more problematic if I overspray too much, so I am much more careful, operating with small trigger movements and short controlled bursts. We are almost done. Now I switch to Calgar Blue using the same dilution, and I shoot this with tiny bursts inside the Calgar Blue highlights. I use this only in the most prominent highlight spots though, mostly on the front of the model. At this point you probably also notice that our imaginary light is coming from above the left shoulder of the model, so the brightest highlights are placed on the left side of the model. And with that we are done with the airbrushing phase. I sprayed a couple of layers of matte varnish over everything to knock back the natural glossiness of the inks and to protect my sprayed on layers, and the end result looks like this. Here you can see it next to another model painted the same way that will be part of the diorama as well. With all the airbrushing done, now it's time to blacken all the elements that were not meant to be blue. But at this stage I also do another important step, I blackline the armor. The airbrush doesn't discriminate, it sprays everything whether it's a raised element or a recess, so now we need to make sure to darken all the recesses and outline all the elements inside the blue.
I simply diluted the same black paint I was using to block in everything, and I used the tip of the brush to paint it into the recesses.
Alright, time to do some edge highlighting and scratches to give more definition to the armor. I have a video dedicated to both of those techniques on the channel, so I won't go into deep details here.
You might notice that I use the same color that we finished with in the airbrushing phase. Colors tend to show up much stronger and brighter with the brush, so the same Kargar blue will still work as a brighter highlight, especially in areas where we only sprayed the darker colors. I paint every single edge with this all over the model, using the side of the brush mostly, as I turn the model whenever I can instead of moving the brush. It's better to make the edges align with the way it's comfortable for you to paint the highlights instead of trying to paint in an uncomfortable position with the brush. I also do a lot of little scratches and marks on the armor with the tip of the brush. The airbrush creates an unnaturally smooth and perfect surface, so I like to break that up by adding imperfections on the armor. Nothing drastic, we won't be doing proper battle damage this time, just some scuff marks and a little chipping. After this step, the armor looks way more defined and more interesting, but we can make it even better by doing one more round of highlights. This time I'm using Fenrisian Grey and I do mostly the same thing, but this time I'm much more selective in where I put the highlights. I paint only the edges that are facing up and leave the rest painted in only the previous color. Some longer edges can be partially in shadows and partially in the light. In this case, I only paint the part of the edge that is in the light, and I might add a couple of dots where I finish the highlight so it doesn't end so abruptly. I also highlight some of the dots and scratches I made earlier by painting this lighter color super thinly inside them. Now the armor is even more defined and the edge highlights match the intensity of the volumetric highlights we did with the airbrush. So now I turn my attention to the right shoulder pad. I partially base coated this with the white ink, but then I naturally oversprayed it a little with the blue. Now I base coated the whole thing with multiple layers of Ultramarine Grey and then cheated a little and added a couple of layers of Silver Grey from AK Interactive because the Ultramarine Grey just wouldn't cover properly. I also painted the top half of the mini shield on the shoulder with this combo to make that element a little more interesting. Finally, I cheated some more and I sprayed the top of the shoulder pad with a little dead white from Vallejo to add a little highlight on the top. We will get back to this a little bit later with some white edge highlights, but for now it was time to add some transfers. I added a nice big Ultramarine symbol on the freshly painted white shoulder pad and a couple of smaller things on the shield as well.
With the armor mostly done, I painted a couple of smaller but still important elements before moving on to the metals.
Ultramarine guns these days are mostly painted black on the box art, but I think that is boring, so my Ultramarines always have red guns, which go really nicely with the blue armor. I base coated this gun in the very beginning with the corn red and I haven't touched it since, and now I can do some highlights over that. So I use the usual combination of Mephiston Red, Wild Rider Red, Evilson Scarlet and Troll Slayer Orange here. First I covered quite a bit of the original base coat, but as I went brighter and more orange, I started to concentrate more on just the edge highlights and some diagonal lines to create an interesting transition between the colors. Keeping in mind once again where the light is coming from, the orange highlights are more prominent on the upper left side of the gun. Next I painted the tabard and the purity seals. I used pretty much the same colors for both, except a little trick in the end that made the tabards different. I base coated everything with Zandri dust using multiple coats to get full coverage. Then I highlighted up everything with Ushabti bone, concentrating on the left side of the folds where the light would hit them the most. And finally I mostly just painted the edge highlights with some Wraith bone on both the tabards and the seals. Now for the trick on the tabards. I diluted some Mournfang brown quite heavily and glazed it at the bottom, especially in the shadow areas. I did multiple consecutive layers, starting a little lower with each one until I was happy with how dark the effect is. To finish the seals, I base coated them in Nagaroth Night and then painted the raised elements with Genestealer purple. Finally, I painted Emperor's Children's pink over some of the raised bits, especially where they were facing the light, keeping some of the previous colors still visible.
With that done, now it's time for another big defining color for Ultramarines, the gold trim. And I know that not all companies use the gold trim, but I can't imagine an Ultramarine without the gold, so let's paint some gold non-metallic metal with Citadel paints.
I didn't have the proper tone I wanted for the base coat of the gold in my Citadel collection, so I mixed some Corn Red and Rhinox Hide together about 50% each to get what I needed. I painted this over all the raised elements of the gold trim and decorations, covering mostly everything but leaving the recesses and the deepest shadows in the original black. Contrast is super important for non-metallics, especially on small surfaces like the trim and the Aquila, so ideally we go from black in the shadows to all the way to white in the highlights. I used multiple coats, especially over the area where the light would hit the most. Next I switched to Mournfang Brown and I repeated all the exercise with this dark orange brown, but now I concentrated even more on the light areas, still covering those mostly fully and only doing edge highlights on the rest. Scrag Brown came next, and you might notice that I'm going up in brightness in small increments. I could do bigger jumps using less steps, but then I would need to do some glazing. I'm essentially avoiding the glazing step by adding more steps in the gradient I'm building. Also, I'm slowly concentrating more and more on the top left side of the elements, leaving the right side darker and doing only a couple of edge highlights there. Until this point I was doing reds and then orangish browns. Now it's time to move into the yellow territory using Everland Sunset. I'm still trying to avoid colors with too much white in them, since I want to get as much saturation in the midtones as possible so that I can afford to lose some in the highest highlights without making the whole thing faded and devoid of color. I repeat my usual exercise but reduce the size of the highlights even more and only edge highlight the edges which would be directly hit by the light. In the shadow areas I still make a couple of dots and partial edge highlights. I'll go with Phalanx Yellow next, and this will be the last saturated color in the recipe. This one is super vibrant and bright, and this is the one that will make the non-metallic metal look like shiny yellow gold. I do three things with this: a smaller highlight inside the previous bigger one, edge highlights on the surfaces pointing up but most of the time only covering part of the edge, and finally small diagonal lines and dots on the larger surfaces to add detail and mask transitions. As you can see, I really focus this on the top left of the elements. A good example is the Aquila, where the right side barely received a couple of dots and partial edge highlights with this, while the left turned quite yellow. Now it's time to add a color with a lot of white in it to dial up the contrasts. I also switched to a smaller brush here and tried to go for very fine thin edge highlights and tiny dots. And it's important to be conservative with this. If you cover too much of the previous saturated colors, the armor will lose its vibrance and become flat. It is also important to leave the shadows alone. It's easy to fall into the mistake of over-highlighting. Less is more in this stage of the process. Finally, I added the finishing touches with white. This last step is quite important since this creates the amount of contrast between the shadows and the lights that creates the metallic look. But here it's even more important to not cover too much, otherwise we'll lose too much color. By the way, I'm obviously cutting out a lot of footage here so I can fit it into the length of a YouTube video, but if you want to see how I did it in real time, you can check out the time-lapse video on my Patreon. Since I already had the white out, I also did the highlights I was still missing on the right shoulder pad as well. I highlighted the pauldron and the white part of the shield and also added some small scratches and dots, even overlapping with the Ultramarine symbol so it doesn't look too perfect.
Now that the gold is done, it's time to do the steel bits as well. These are a bit more generic and not unique to Ultramarines, so I will go through them a bit quicker, but you can find all the details in the Patreon footage.
I used staggered and scale green to cover about 80% of all the metal elements. Everything got edge highlights and the parts facing the light got fully covered. Even in the shadows I added at least some scratches and dots. I repeated the same process with Mechanica Standard Grey, but now covering about 60-70% of the previous highlight. I also only highlighted the edges facing up. I repeated the same again with Dawnstone, but now on an even smaller surface, and then with Administratum Grey, reducing the size of the highlights and the edges I covered even further. And around this point we mostly run out of space and also of blue-grey tones before white, so I use Ulthorn Grey mainly to edge highlight some prominent edges facing the light and do some very small highlights inside the previous ones where there is still space for them. Finally, I paint only some of the most prominent edges and add some small dots here and there with pure white. With the steel done now, I only have the face to paint and a couple of interesting effects to add in the end. I base coated the face with Doombull Brown, completely covering it with multiple coats. Then I covered almost everything again with Bugman's Glow, only leaving the deepest shadows darker, mostly the eyes and the inner right side of the face since the rest is covered by the mask. With Cadian Fleshtone I highlighted mostly the left side of the face since that is the one facing the light. I focus on the forehead and the cheeks, leaving a little bit of the previous color around the new highlights, smoothing them together as much as possible. Finally, with Kislev Flesh, I added even smaller highlights inside the previous ones, once again mostly on the left side of the face. And to make the highlights shine more and to add a little life into the skin, I glazed a little magenta into the shadows, followed by some super thin glazes of laser yellow in the midtones. Now I just had to add a couple of details and effects before I could call it a day. First, I made tiny scratches and marks with the point of the brush on the purity seals to make it look like something is written on them, using slightly diluted black paint. Then I started the glow effect on the sword by dropping slightly diluted airbrush white into the script on the sword. I made sure that the recesses are fully covered and I didn't mind if the edges also got a little white on them. This will only help make it look more like the script glows. Once I was happy with the white, I loaded some slightly diluted orange fluorescent paint into the airbrush and I sprayed it all over the script. Overspray wasn't really a problem because it just adds to the effect and the orange will show up on the white much faster than on the surrounding darker areas. This needs quite a few layers, so it's important to be patient and allow time for the layers to dry before spraying more. But when I was done, it was time to call him finished and the final result looks like this. I think he's the coolest Ultramarine I've ever painted and hopefully even Guilliman would be happy with him, so now I just have to paint all the characters and the diorama around him to see how he will look on a big scenic background. In the next couple of videos you will see me paint some of those things before I reveal the whole diorama, so don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss those.
If you have made it this far, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to give the video a like and drop a comment under it as well. It really helps the channel out. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible. Without them, I wouldn't be able to dedicate the time necessary to keep the channel going. And that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.